I've worked crime scene and trauma cleanup for a little over 12 years now. And on one particular specific job, back during my 4th year on the job, I walked directly into an apartment that had, according to the property manager who hired us, sat completely sealed and untouched since the incident 6 days earlier, and found a space that was, by any reasonable professional standard I've carefully developed over more than a full decade of this specific work, already partially and deliberately cleaned, specific surfaces wiped, certain items rearranged, in a pattern that made genuinely no sense for anything a first responder would ever have done, and even less sense for a property that supposedly, according to every record, nobody at all had entered since police originally released the scene. I need to explain what this job actually involves before any of this makes sense, because I think most people's idea of it comes almost entirely from television and isn't remotely close to how the work actually functions day to day. We get called after a death, usually unattended, sometimes violent, sometimes just someone who passed alone and wasn't found for a while. And our job is methodical, deliberate, almost clinical in its structure, documenting absolutely everything visible before we ever actually touch a single item, because insurance and sometimes law enforcement need a clear record of the scene exactly as we found it, which means I've developed gradually over these 12 years of doing this specific work week after week, an extremely specific, almost involuntary eye for what a genuinely untouched scene actually looks like, versus a scene that's had human hands quietly moving through it sometime after the fact. A distinction most people would never think to look for, but that becomes, eventually, almost impossible to unsee once you've trained yourself to notice it. Before I tell you what tipped me off, I want to ask you something, because I think this is a job most people never think about until they need it, and by then, it's already the worst day of their life. If you found out a professional had noticed something in your home that didn't add up, something suggesting someone had been there when they shouldn't have been, would you want to know, or would you rather never find out? I really want you to think about that, honestly, for a moment before answering, and then tell me in the comments, because the answer to that question is more complicated than people expect once it's actually their own home. Subscribe if you want the other 2 jobs I'm going to tell you about, because I think the third one is the reason I finally started keeping a personal log of every scene I work. Now, the apartment. I want to walk you through exactly what caught my attention, because I think the specific mechanics of it matter more than the conclusion. The specific detail that actually stopped me cold at the door was the dust. Trauma scenes that sit sealed for several days develop a very particular, undisturbed layer of dust and settling on every horizontal surface. Something I check almost unconsciously now after this many years. And in this apartment, most of it looked exactly right, except for a bookshelf near the window where several books had been pulled slightly forward from the others, and a kitchen counter where a coffee mug sat rinsed and upside down in the drying rack, completely dry, no residue, no dust on it at all. In a kitchen where every other dish in the sink still had 6 days of settling on it. I called my partner over without saying anything specific yet, just asked her to take a look at the kitchen and tell me if anything struck her as off, deliberately not leading her toward what I'd already noticed. And within about 30 seconds, she pointed at the exact same mug, unprompted, which told me immediately I wasn't imagining the discrepancy or overthinking a scene the way exhaustion sometimes makes you do on a long shift. She confirmed she'd caught it too, but had assumed, the same as I initially had, that maybe a family member had somehow been given brief, supervised access before our arrival. Which does happen occasionally. Grief makes people push hard for exceptions to standard procedure, and property managers don't always document every small courtesy they extend to a grieving family, We called the property manager directly from the unit to confirm one way or another, and she told us, flatly and without hesitation, that nobody at all, not family, not police, not maintenance staff, had been issued a key or granted any form of access to that specific unit since the scene was officially released a full 6 days earlier, that she'd personally verified the lock hadn't been serviced or rekeyed, and that as far as her records showed, we were the very first people to physically enter that apartment since the medical examiner's team left. We finished the job that afternoon exactly as scheduled, documented the discrepancy carefully in our own internal report, the way company policy requires us to, for absolutely anything unusual we encounter on a scene. And I never once, in the years since, found out what actually explained any part of it. No explanation was ever given to us, no follow-up conversation from anyone involved, nothing at all. The file simply closed itself the way most of our files eventually do, quietly, without any real resolution, because resolving that kind of lingering mystery has genuinely never been part of what we're actually paid to do. But I think about that mug more than almost anything else from 12 years of this work, because everything else in that apartment told a consistent, coherent story of exactly what happened and when. And that one clean, dry mug sitting upside down in a drying rack was the only piece of evidence in the entire scene that didn't fit anywhere into the timeline anyone could ever construct for me. A small, domestic, completely ordinary object that somebody, for some reason, had needed to wash before we ever got there. My partner brought it up again months later, on a different job entirely, unprompted, telling me she still thought about it sometimes too. And we spent a good 20 minutes in the van afterward, trying to construct some scenario that made sense of it. A family member who'd bribed a building employee for quiet access, a police officer who'd gone back for a personal item and tidied up out of some misplaced sense of respect. And every explanation we came up with fell apart against the same detail, that the mug wasn't just clean, it was completely dry. No lingering moisture in a kitchen, otherwise coated in 6 days of undisturbed dust, meaning whoever washed it hadn't done so recently before we arrived. They'd done so early enough in that 6-day window for it to fully air dry and then sit untouched again for however many days remained. A level of care and patience that didn't match any of the rushed, furtive explanations either of us could actually believe. A homeowner in her late 60s hired our company to clean an unattended death scene in her late husband's small home office. Standard job by every description she gave us over the phone, except that when our team actually arrived, she met us right at the front door herself with an unusual, very specific, carefully worded instruction that we were free to clean anything in that room except one particular wall, which she wanted left completely untouched. And when I gently asked why, half expecting some ordinary sentimental reason, maybe a mural their kids had painted years earlier, something along those lines, she looked directly at me for a long, uncomfortable moment and said only, quietly, he wouldn't want it disturbed, in a tone that made clear the he she meant wasn't necessarily her husband. I've had unusual, specific requests before. This line of work brings out very particular, very personal instructions from grieving families, more often than most people would ever expect. Sentimental objects to be handled a certain way, rooms to be left exactly as they were beyond just the cleaning itself, but something about the flat, careful way she said this specific instruction, and the way she simply wouldn't elaborate further, no matter how gently I pressed for more context, stayed with me the entire time we worked that scene, sitting in the back of my mind, the way an unanswered question always does. And I want to be honest with you, that by the time we actually got a proper, close look at that wall, close enough to clean carefully around it, exactly the way she'd specifically asked us to, I understood, at least partially, exactly what she might have actually meant by that comment. Before I describe what was actually on that wall, I want to say something to anyone who's ever had a strange, specific instruction from a grieving family member that didn't make sense at the time. Subscribe if you want to hear the third job, because it's the one that actually changed how I do this work permanently. And drop a comment telling me if you've ever respected an instruction from someone else, even though you didn't understand it, purely because something about their tone told you not to ask twice. I want to know how many of you have been in that position. Now, the wall. I want to describe the moment we actually saw it fully for the first time, because photographs genuinely don't capture the effect of it the way standing in that room did. The wall itself, once we were actually working in that room with our equipment set up and the overhead light fully on, turned out to be covered, floor to about shoulder height, entirely in small, dense, obsessively careful handwriting. Not decorative, not artistic, just page after page of close, cramped writing done directly onto the drywall itself, done in what looked like a permanent black marker. The ink layered thickly in certain sections where he'd apparently run out of available space and had simply, deliberately written directly over entries he'd already filled in weeks or months before. A wall of text that, from what I could make out without deliberately trying to read it closely, which felt like a violation even though I was standing right in front of it, appeared to be some kind of ongoing, dated log, entries, times, short phrases, the exact kind of compulsive, methodical documentation you'd genuinely expect from someone who had become deeply convinced they needed to keep a meticulous, ongoing record of something specific that was happening to him or around him on a regular basis. The widow herself never explained any of it further, not that day and not afterward. And I never once asked her directly, partly because it genuinely wasn't my place to, and partly because some quiet instinct told me clearly that whatever the answer actually was, it belonged entirely to her and not to me. A stranger she'd hired for a few hours to clean a room. But I did notice, working carefully around that wall for the better part of an afternoon, that several of the entries near the most recent end of the writing, the section closest to the floor, where he must have been sitting or kneeling to write by the time he filled the rest, referenced a name, repeated several times in slightly different contexts, that wasn't hers, wasn't a family member's name she'd mentioned, wasn't anyone I ever heard identified over the course of that job. Just that same unfamiliar name appearing over and over again, alongside specific times, almost always somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, for what looked, judging by how much of that wall it eventually covered, like several full consecutive months, leading right up to the point he died. I finished that entire job without ever once fully understanding what I'd actually spent the afternoon cleaning carefully around. And I think about it, honestly, more than almost any other scene from 12 years of this work, not because of anything overtly disturbing about the writing itself. No threats, nothing violent, just careful, dated, obsessive documentation of something involving a name that meant nothing to anyone else in that man's life. At hours when most of the world is reliably asleep, on a wall, his own widow specifically asked us never to touch, for reasons she made clear, without ever actually explaining them, that had nothing to do with sentiment at all. Before we left that day, she walked us to the door herself, which she genuinely hadn't done when we first arrived that morning, and said one more thing to me quietly that I've turned over in my head more times than I could possibly count since, that her husband had started writing on that wall about 8 months before he died, that she'd asked him about it exactly once, early on, and that his only answer had been that it was easier to keep track of things this way than to trust himself to remember them correctly. A sentence that could describe almost anything: insomnia, anxiety, early cognitive decline, or something considerably harder to explain, and that she'd chosen, deliberately, for her own reasons, to never ask him a second time. The third and final job I'm going to tell you about today is the actual reason I started a personal log of my own, separate from our official paperwork. A habit I've now kept for almost 8 years, and it started with a detail so small that if it had been the only strange thing that ever happened in this line of work, I probably would have forgotten it within a week. A specific, remarkably consistent smell present throughout a scene that had absolutely no explainable physical source anywhere, detected in a fully locked, sealed apartment for a death that had occurred, according to the medical examiner's own official timeline, at least a full 9 days before our team was ever called in to begin work. The apartment itself was genuinely unremarkable in every way. Small, sparsely furnished, the exact kind of space a single occupant, living carefully within a tight, modest budget, tends to maintain. The sort of place that tells you almost nothing distinctive about the person who lived there just from looking at it. And by the time our team actually arrived on scene, the decomposition process had progressed exactly as far as roughly 9 days in that particular apartment's climate and conditions would reasonably predict. Nothing unusual or accelerated about it, which meant our job that day involved dealing with smells that are, frankly, part of the reality of this work, and not something I'm going to describe in detail, because that specific, expected smell is not what I'm telling you about. Underneath it, distinct enough that both my partner and I separately commented on it within the first few minutes of suiting up, was something else entirely. A sweet, floral smell, specific and recognizable enough that I associated it immediately, and honestly still do to this day, with a particular, very specific brand of drugstore perfume, present strongly enough near the apartment's single closet that we both, independently, walked toward that closet assuming we'd find a bottle that had tipped over or leaked at some point. Before I tell you what we actually found in that closet, I want to say something directly, because I think this detail is going to sit with some of you the way it sat with me for 8 years now. Subscribe if these 3 jobs have been the kind of thing you want more of, because I've got years of these left to tell. And drop a comment letting me know which of the 3 stuck with you most. The mug, the wall, or this one, because I genuinely want to know. And I read every single comment on these videos personally. Now, the closet. There was no perfume bottle. We searched that closet thoroughly and methodically, the way we're trained to document any anomaly. Every shelf checked twice, every pocket of every hanging garment turned out, the floor swept clear, a small shoebox of old photographs and papers tucked into the back corner, opened and gone through page by page, and found absolutely nothing. No bottle, no spray residue, no stain, nothing that could physically account for a scent that specific and that strong concentrated in that exact location, in an apartment that had been fully locked and, according to every single record made available to us by the property manager, completely undisturbed for well over a full week before we were ever called in. The smell itself was noticeably strongest right at the closet floor level, faded gradually and noticeably as you moved higher up toward the hanging clothes above, and was, by the time we finally finished processing that specific area, roughly 40 minutes later, simply completely gone, not faded gradually the way a scent naturally dissipates once its source is removed or disturbed. Just absent, the way a sound stops the instant you turn off whatever was making it. I mentioned it to the property manager when she came by later that afternoon to inspect our completed work, mostly just as an odd passing aside, rather than anything I genuinely expected her to have real information about. And she went quiet in a way that told me, before she said another word, that this wasn't going to be a mundane explanation. She told me the previous tenant of that exact unit, several years before the man we'd just cleaned up after had ever moved in, had been a woman who'd worn that same specific, recognizable drugstore perfume constantly, distinctively enough that other tenants on that floor still occasionally mentioned her by scent alone, years after she'd moved out under, in the manager's careful words, complicated circumstances she wasn't going to get into with me. I didn't ask her to elaborate. The same instinct that kept me from pushing the widow on the wall kept me quiet here too. And I started my personal log that same week. A habit that's now spanned almost 8 years and dozens of entries. Small, specific, unexplainable details from scene after scene that never make it into our official paperwork, because there's no professional category for logging something that simply doesn't have an explanation, only a place in whatever it is I've been quietly keeping track of instead, in a notebook nobody else has ever asked to read, for reasons that make considerably more sense to me now than they did the day I started it. I looked, eventually, a few weeks after that job, for whatever information I could find on the previous tenant the property manager had mentioned, the woman connected to that same perfume, and found almost nothing. No obituary, no public record of what the manager had vaguely called complicated circumstances, just a name on an old lease document the property manager let me glance at, out of what I think was her own quiet unease about the whole thing. A name that meant nothing to me, attached to a unit she'd apparently vacated abruptly enough that the manager remembered it clearly years later, without needing to check any file at all. The kind of clean, sudden departure that property managers tend to remember, precisely because nobody ever explains it to them afterward. 12 years of this work has taught me that most scenes are exactly what they appear to be. Sad, human, explainable in every detail, if you're patient enough to look closely, but there's a specific, small percentage that aren't, that leave behind something that doesn't fit the timeline, doesn't have a source, doesn't resolve no matter how carefully you document it. And I've come to believe, after 8 years of writing these details down, instead of simply forgetting them the way I used to, that the spaces where people die alone, unattended, sometimes for days or weeks before anyone finds them, become, in some way I can't fully explain and have stopped trying to, considerably less empty than the paperwork ever accounts for, and that whatever fills that particular kind of silence isn't always finished with the room by the time we're finally called in to clean it.